Today I'm going to talk about making using adapted lenses a little bit easier on your Pen F. So in my previous video I talked a little bit about how to program the custom mode dials, and I'm just going to do a little bit of an extension on that and set up the custom mode dials so that when I'm using adapted lenses it'll make it a little easier for me or you when we're out in the field and also when we come back into post-production. And that's primarily two or three things. One, we want to program the lens information into the Pen F because there's usually, with most adapters, there's no electronic contacts to tell the camera what kind of lens you're using. Also, I'll touch a little bit on focus peaking. If you're using adapted lenses, you're probably already familiar with that, so I won't go into too much of that. And then also how to name these lenses so that they're a little bit easier to recognize when you're in post-production. In my case, I use Lightroom for my photo editing. So let's go, without further ado, let's go into that. So let me turn on the Pen F. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, I'm going to reset the camera back to factory settings. So that's it. And as you can see, all the custom mode dials have been reset. And then we'll go into picture mode, and I talked about this in my last video. It's set to natural, which is fine. Picture resolution, I'm going to change this to large, fine, raw, and then I'm going to go into my shutter and I'm going to change this to anti-shock, single shot. And that's it there, nothing there. So let's go into the custom menu. First thing I'm going to do, and let's talk about, let me turn off the info here. Let's talk about the MF menu, the autofocus manual focus. This only applies to when you're using an autofocus lens with the camera, so there's nothing in there we really need to see. I'll just skim that real quick. But what I do want to go into is in the button dial menu. And I'm going to program the function button. And in my case, I prefer to program the FN1 button. As you can see right now, the FN1 button is programmed for AEL, AFL, and that's not much use when you're using adapted lenses. So we're going to change this one to lens info setting, and I just push the up button twice, but just if it doesn't come up right away, just keep scrolling and hit enter. Okay, and then the next button I'm going to program is this front function button, which is indicated here in the menu, and there's a right arrow, so I can go over to the right, and I'm going to change this to focus peaking. So I'm going to keep going down till I see it, and there. So now this function button in the front will be programmed for peaking. Okay, and that's pretty much it. I think I probably do want to go into menu D and scroll down to the focus peaking area. Here we go, peaking settings. And for me, the default is white normal and image brightness adjust on. For me, I prefer yellow because I don't shoot too many things that are yellow. So it'll be easier to see where the focus peaking is happening. And highlight intensity, normal is fine. If you set it higher, for example, to high, what that's going to do is peak on a wider area. So it's going to act like a wider depth of field. And then if you set it to low, it's only going to peak on the most finest areas of the image. So that's sort of like a shallower depth of field, if you want to think of it that way. And for most things, though, normal is fine. You can experiment with that on your own and see what you prefer. And then this is also another personal preference, image brightness adjustment on. And you can read what the menu here basically says, but when you're focus peaking, it's going to adjust the viewfinder brightness or brightness of the live view so that it's easier to see where the focus peak is happening, but then it doesn't show you what the actual exposure is going to look like. And that's one of the benefits, in my opinion, of the EVF and the live view, is you can see the exposure of the image before you shoot. So I prefer to turn that off. And honestly, you can still see the peaking just fine in 99% of the situations. But again, experiment with the kind of things you shoot and see what works best for you. Okay, and let's see. The next thing we can do is we're going to go down to menu K, or utility, and scroll down to the lens info setting. Right now it's set to off, and what that means is the camera is going to look for the electronic data from the from an autofocus lens or Olympus or Panasonic lens designed for the Micro Four Thirds system. And when it's off, it's going to assume and get the exif data from there. But when you're using adapted lenses, that's just not the case. So what you can do is you can create the lens information in the camera. And this is important for mainly two reasons. One is, and this is a big one, is the camera's image stabilization has to be tuned to the focal length of the lens. So if you have the focal length of the lens, say, you're using a 200 to 500 or 500 millimeters lens, and you have the image stabilization set up for a 35 or 50 millimeter lens, the image stabilization is going to work against you, and it's going to be very jumpy, and it's just going to be a horrible mess. And that's why you want to change the focal information of the lens for the camera for these adapted lenses, so it knows how to tune the image stabilization to the focal length. And I have two lenses already set up in here. I think the camera comes default with one of the Olympus fisheyes in there, and I just deleted that because that's not the lens I use or own. But I've set it up for the 35 millimeter f1.6 I bought here, and I also have one set up for my 50 millimeter Nikon f1.8. And let me just show you how to do that real quick. What I'll do first is I'll just go ahead and delete this and put it back in just for this exercise. So we click on create lens information, and this is the next tip. You want to name the lens in case in this particular case, at least for me, and I'll explain that in a second. I can't think and type at the same time. But I'll do this real quick and then I'll explain. Okay, just real quick, I made a mistake here. I didn't put a space after the MM. So to go up here and delete that F, you hit the info button and you scroll back, and then you just hit the trash icon here, button down here, and that gets rid of it. And then to go back down into the lettering, hit the info button again. This little underscore thing here is a space. Okay, now I can get this right. I'll use a lowercase f and a slash, and I'm going to put in 1.8. Okay, and that looks good. So I'll scroll down to, and I'll click on the end, meaning I'm done. So now this is programmed lens name into the exif data whenever it takes a picture. Next thing I want to do is set up the focal length, and as I mentioned earlier, this is important for the image stabilization to work properly. And the aperture value, you can leave this blank, or I just like to put in f1.8, even though that's not the actual case. If you leave it blank, that's probably more accurate because you never know what aperture you're going to be shooting at. But I just set it to 1.8. just because it's easier to search for and for other reasons for me personally, but you can do anything. And then that's it. That's all the camera wants or needs. And you hit set. So you can see very quickly it programmed or said number 2 lens has been programmed. Okay, so now that that's all set up, what's going to happen is, let's say you're out in the field and you had your autofocus lens on your Pen F and you want to switch to your adapted lens. So let's say I just took off my Olympus 25mm f1.7 or 1.8 and I want to put on my 35mm f1.6. And I put that on. There. Now the camera doesn't know what lens I just put on it, so I'm going to tell it, and a very quick way to get to that is, remember I programmed the function button, and that menu pops right up, and I scroll over, up, click over, oops, I'm sorry, click OK, and OK, and then menu for back. So now when I take pictures, every picture I take is going to have the lens information in the exif data, and also the image stabilization is going to work and it's tuned for 35mm focal length. And again, like I said, that's very important, and you can experiment with that for yourself. You know, set the focal length artificially to say 200mm, then put a 35mm lens in there and then see how bad your image stabilization is. So that's why I do that. And then when I actually want to focus on something, you're going to see the other side of my basement here, which is a mess. But remember I programmed this function button for focus peaking. So I'll click on that button and you can see how this little lamp here is being highlighted in yellow. And that's why I like to have that. Sometimes, you know, if I want to see the picture without the focus peaking and look at it, sometimes I like to just see the image, you know, without any of this info stuff all around it. But I can still click on the focus peaking and I can focus right there on the lamp. And that's that. Okay, so let me just double check some of the other settings, and then I'm going to program that whole thing into my custom 1 dial, because if I change modes, you know, if I go from manual to shutter priority or something, I'm going to lose that function 1 button. I haven't figured out the exact sequence of why that gets lost sometimes, but if I program the C1 button to that, then I know it'll always be there. So let's go into the menu. Let's go into the super control panel first, and I want to double check that C1 is exactly how I want it to be in terms of shooting. So I do shoot auto ISO, aperture priority. So right now we're good on auto ISO. Auto white balance is fine. Focusing makes no difference. I'm on anti-shock. I have large, fine plus raw. Full matrix metering here. The function 1 button is set to exif. I do see it's an sRGB, and since I use Lightroom, I like to shoot in Adobe RGB. And everything else looks good. Okay, so let's program all of these settings in the custom 1. So we'll go back out to the main menu here, which is shooting menu number 1. Go into the first line item here, reset assign custom modes, and as you can see, C1's not assigned with the double dash. This right arrow means I can go over to the right, and I don't need to do anything. I just says set current shooting mode in settings, and I can just click OK. But let's scroll down and see what these are. If you want to reset it, you can do it in each individual custom mode or custom setting 1, 2, 3, 4. But let's just go ahead and set custom 1, just like that. Okay, and that's it. So let's say I'm on the field and I'm done shooting with my 35. I can swap over to my 50mm lens, line up the red dots. I'm kind of doing this blind, but there. And I hit the function 1 button, scroll down, click OK. And now the lens and the camera are tuned together at 50mm for the image stabilization and the exif data. Okay, let me talk about why I named the lens the way I did. When I use this 50mm Nikon f1.8 on my Nikon, the Nikon takes that exif data, saves it with the picture, and when I'm editing in Lightroom and import it and edit into Lightroom, I can sort by the attributes via exif data. So in the attributes you'll see it'll say 50mm f1.8, and I want to name give that lens the same exact name in my Olympus, so that when I import the images from my Olympus camera, the exif data will be identical letter for letter in Lightroom. And that way, let's say I want to compare images using the same exact 50mm lens between the Pen F and my Nikon. I can just highlight 50mm f1.8 one time, and all cameras that use that lens, in this case I would be comparing a Pen F and a D750, will show up. And that's really handy. You know, if you're a pixel peeper like me and just like to look at the pictures and compare and try to get the most you can out of the Olympus Pen F, because you know you just can't compare a Micro Four Thirds sensor with a full frame sensor in most cases, particularly when you get in lower light. So it's nice to be able to do those kind of comparisons. So when you go out, if you're used to shooting with, say, another camera, when you go out and you start shooting with your Pen F and you're not getting the results you want, you can kind of compare the images directly and fine-tune your shooting settings on your Pen F so that it performs a little bit more like what you were used to, in my case the D750. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. Please subscribe. If you have any questions or comments about any things I've done here, just leave it below and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. I appreciate you watching. Okay, thank you.